The day of my grandfather's funeral was the first time my entire family had been in the same room in years. Everyone kept saying the same things people always say at funerals. He lived a long life. He was a good man. He'll be missed. But the moment I said Grandpa had left something important in the safe in his study, my father laughed. Not a quiet laugh, the kind that makes everyone in the room turn and look. "Stop lying about your grandfather, Sophie," he said loudly. My brother smirked from the couch. My mother rubbed her temples like she was already tired of dealing with me. No one believed me. That wasn't surprising. In my family, Sophie Bennett being called a liar wasn't shocking. It was normal. But 20 minutes later, the lawyer opened my grandfather's safe. And suddenly, no one in that room was laughing anymore. To understand why, you need to understand something about my family and the role I've played in it my entire life. My name is Sophie Bennett, and if you asked my parents to describe me growing up, they would probably say I had one very specific problem. According to them, I had a habit of not telling the truth. Not big lies, not dramatic stories, just things that never seemed to line up with the version of reality my family preferred. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Cleveland. The kind of neighborhood where everyone mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and waved politely when they passed each other in the driveway. From the outside, the Bennett family looked perfectly normal. My father, Daniel Bennett, worked as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company. He believed strongly in discipline appearances and the idea that children should earn their place in the world. My mother, Linda Bennett, was the softer one, or at least she liked to think she was. She volunteered at church-baked pies for neighborhood fundraisers and told everyone who would listen that family was the most important thing in life. Then there was my older brother, Jason. Jason was 2 years older than me, and according to my parents, practically perfect. Good grades, good at sports, polite to adults, teachers loved him, coaches praised him, and my parents never missed a chance to remind me how lucky I was to have such an excellent example living under the same roof. Then there was me. If Jason brought home an A, my parents framed it. If I brought home an A, they asked why it wasn't an A plus. If Jason forgot to do something, it was an accident. If I forgot something, it was proof I was irresponsible. And if Jason and I disagreed about what had happened during an argument, my parents didn't even bother asking for my side. They already knew who was telling the truth. Jason doesn't lie, my father used to say, which meant by default that I did. The strange thing is that I wasn't even a particularly rebellious kid. I didn't sneak out, I didn't drink, I didn't get into trouble at school, but for some reason the label stuck early. The liar. And once a family decides who you are, it's almost impossible to change their minds. I think the first time I realized how deeply that label had settled in was when I was 9 years old. Jason had broken a lamp in the living room while throwing a baseball inside the house. When Mom found it shattered on the floor, she called both of us into the room. "Which one of you did this?" she asked. Jason immediately pointed at me. "Sophie was running through here earlier," he said. That wasn't true. I had been upstairs doing homework. I said exactly that. But Jason didn't hesitate. He told the story calmly, confidently, adding just enough detail to make it sound believable. Dad listened for about 10 seconds before making his decision. "Sophie," he said firmly, "you need to learn to take responsibility for your actions." I remember the frustration burning in my chest. I didn't do it. I insisted. Jason looked offended, like I had just accused him of something terrible. "I'm not lying," he said. And that was the end of the discussion. I was grounded for a week. The next day, my grandfather came over to visit. Arthur Bennett was the only person in the family who didn't seem interested in choosing sides. He sat at the kitchen table with me while I sulked over a bowl of cereal. "You look like someone stole your dog," he said. I told him what happened with the lamp, the whole story. When I finished, he didn't interrupt or correct me. He just listened. Then he leaned back in his chair and studied my face for a moment. "You telling me the truth?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded once. "All right then. That was it. No lecture, no suspicion, no raised eyebrow. Just belief." And for a 9-year-old who had spent most of her life feeling like the least reliable narrator in her own home, that simple moment meant everything. From then on, Grandpa and I had a quiet understanding. Whenever the family gathered for holidays or birthdays, he'd usually end up sitting next to me. He'd ask about school, about the books I was reading, about whatever random project I'd gotten obsessed with that month. He didn't treat me like the problem child, he treated me like a person, which in my family made him the exception. As Jason and I got older, the gap between how we were treated only grew wider. Jason became the star athlete in high school, football captain, homecoming court, the kind of kid teachers described as a natural leader. My parents went to every one of his games. They bought banners for the yard. They invited relatives to come watch him play. Meanwhile, I discovered I was good at something completely different: computers. Not just using them, fixing them, building them, understanding how they worked. By the time I was 15, I could repair most of the broken laptops teachers brought into the school office. I helped classmates recover files they thought were gone forever. I even built my own computer out of secondhand parts. My parents barely noticed. One night at dinner, I tried explaining a coding project I was working on. Dad listened for about 20 seconds before cutting me off. "That's nice, Sophie," he said. "But you should really focus on things that matter in the real world." Jason smirked across the table. "Yeah," he said. "Not everyone can just sit in their room playing with computers all day." My mother nodded. "Your brother has real goals." I remember looking down at my plate, pushing a piece of chicken around with my fork. Because the truth was, I did have goals. My parents just didn't understand them. Grandpa did, though. A few weeks later, he asked me to come by his house to take a look at something. When I got there, he led me into his study. On the desk sat a dusty old desktop computer that looked like it had survived 3 different decades. "It stopped working," he said. "I fixed it in less than an hour." When the screen flickered back to life, Grandpa grinned like I had just performed a magic trick. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. After that, he started calling me whenever something in his house needed fixing. His computer, his Wi-Fi router, the ancient security system that protected the house he'd lived in for 40 years. And every time I helped him, he paid attention in a way my parents never had. He asked questions, listened to the answers, treated my skills like they actually mattered. Over time, those visits became our thing. Sometimes I'd fix something. Sometimes we'd just sit in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking about whatever crossed his mind. It was during one of those visits, about 3 months before he passed away, that he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. "Sophie," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you ever notice how families decide who someone is and then never update the story?" I shrugged. "I guess." He smiled a little sadly. "People get comfortable with their version of the truth." I didn't know it then, but that conversation was leading somewhere. Somewhere that would eventually bring us back to the moment standing in his living room after the funeral, with my father calling me a liar in front of everyone, and a safe in Grandpa's study that was about to prove something none of them were ready to hear. As Jason and I moved into our late teenage years, the difference in how we were treated stopped being subtle. It became obvious. Jason could do almost anything, and my parents would find a way to explain it away. If he missed curfew, it was because practice ran late. If his grades slipped, it was because sports demanded so much time. If he got into an argument with a teacher, my father would immediately assume the teacher had misunderstood him. Jason was talented, charismatic, and confident. But he also knew something important. He knew my parents believed him, which meant he rarely had to prove anything. I, on the other hand, had to prove everything. And even when I did, it often didn't matter. I remember one specific afternoon during my junior year of high school. I had just won second place in a regional programming competition. It wasn't something the school usually celebrated. Most people didn't even understand what the competition was, but it meant a lot to me. I came home excited, holding the certificate in my hands. My parents were in the living room watching television. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my heart was racing a little. "I got second place today." My mother looked up briefly. "In what, the programming competition I told you about?" I said. Dad muted the television. That computer thing again. Yeah. Jason walked into the room just then, tossing his football bag on the floor. What's going on? He asked. Sophie got second place in some computer contest, my mother said. Jason nodded slowly like he was trying to be polite. Well, second place isn't bad, he said. The way he said it made it sound like a consolation prize. Dad turned the television back on. That's nice, he said. But remember, Sophie, hobbies are hobbies. You still need to think about a real career. I stood there for a moment holding the certificate. No one asked what the competition involved. No one asked how many schools had participated. No one asked if I was proud. Eventually, I went upstairs and taped the certificate to the wall above my desk. Grandpa was the only one who asked about it later. When I told him what had happened, he shook his head slowly. You ever hear the phrase familiar blindness? He asked. No. It means people stop seeing what's right in front of them because they've already decided what they expect to see. I didn't realize how accurate that was until a year later. Senior year. College applications. Jason had already committed to a state university on a football scholarship. My parents threw a huge dinner for him when the letter arrived. Relatives came over. There was cake. My dad made a toast about how proud he was. A few months later, I received an acceptance email from a respected computer science program across the state. Not only that, they offered me a significant scholarship because of my programming competition results. I printed the email and brought it downstairs. Mom was in the kitchen. Look, I said, handing her the paper. She skimmed it quickly. That's far away, she said. Not really. It's only 3 hours. Dad read it next. Computer science, he said. Yes. He frowned slightly. That's a pretty competitive field. I know. And you're sure you can keep up with something like that? It wasn't a compliment. It was doubt. Jason leaned against the counter. Don't worry, he said with a grin. If it doesn't work out, you can always come home and fix Grandpa's computer. They laughed. I tried to laugh too, but inside something quietly shifted. Because I realized something important in that moment. No matter what I achieved, my parents had already decided who I was. And that version of Sophie Bennett didn't include success. Grandpa came to my high school graduation. He sat in the front row while my parents spent most of the ceremony talking with relatives about Jason's upcoming football season. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside. You proud of yourself? He asked. Yes, I said. Good, he replied. Because sometimes you're the only one who will be. That summer before college, I started spending even more time at his house, partly because he needed help with his computer, but mostly because his house felt different from mine. Quieter, safer, more honest. Grandpa had lived in that house for 42 years. It was filled with old furniture, stacks of books, and boxes of paperwork that looked like they hadn't been touched since the early 90s. One afternoon, while we were organizing some files in his study, he pointed to a large metal safe built into the wall behind a painting. You know what that is? He asked. A safe, I said. He chuckled. Very observant. I didn't know you had one. Most people don't. He walked over and tapped the metal door lightly. I've kept important things in there for years. Like what? He thought for a moment. Documents, records, things that matter. I didn't ask more questions. At the time, it didn't seem important. Looking back now, that moment was the first hint of the secret that would eventually change everything. Over the next few years, life pulled the Bennett family in different directions. Jason moved into his college dorm and quickly became the center of attention on his football team. My parents visited him constantly. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my studies. Computer science was harder than anything I'd done before. But it was also exciting. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who actually cared about the same things I did. Coding, problem solving, building systems that could do things most people didn't even realize were possible. And for the first time, no one assumed I was lying when I explained something. Grandpa and I still talked regularly. Sometimes he called to ask about his computer. Sometimes he just wanted to chat. But about a year before he died, our conversation started to change. He began asking more questions about security, data storage, encryption. At first, I thought he was just curious. Then one afternoon, he said something that made me pause. Sophie. He asked casually if someone wanted to store information in a way that couldn't be altered. How would they do that? I remember raising an eyebrow. What kind of information? The kind people might argue about later. I didn't realize it then. But that conversation was the beginning of a plan. A plan my grandfather had been quietly preparing for years. A plan that would eventually lead us back to that living room on the day of his funeral. With my father calling me a liar, and a safe in the study waiting to be opened. By the time I finished my second year of college, something had changed in the Bennett family, not dramatically, not in a way anyone talked about out loud, but you could feel it. Jason's football career, which had been the center of my parents' world for years, suddenly hit a wall. He tore a ligament in his knee during his sophomore season. At first, everyone thought he'd recover quickly, but the surgery didn't go as planned. His coach stopped calling, the scholarship was reduced, and the version of Jason my parents had built their entire identity around the star athlete, the future success story started to fade. For the first time in my life, Jason didn't look completely confident. Meanwhile, my life was quietly moving in the opposite direction. I had landed a part-time internship with a cybersecurity firm during my second year. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well and gave me experience most students wouldn't get until after graduation. I didn't tell my parents at first, not because it was a secret, but because I knew how the conversation would go. Dad would say something like, "That's nice, but you should focus on your classes." Mom would ask if it was interfering with my social life, and Jason would probably joke that I was working for some nerd hacker company. So instead, the person I told was Grandpa. He listened carefully as I explained what the company did: network security, data protection, digital forensics. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "That sounds important," he said. "It is," I replied. Then he asked something that caught me off guard. "Do you trust the people you work with?" "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Just curious." At the time, I assumed he was simply interested in my life. But looking back, I think he was already thinking several steps ahead. Because over the next few months, he started asking me for more help than usual. Not just with his computer, with information. One evening when I visited his house, he had several old folders spread across the dining room table. Bills, property documents, bank statements. "What's all this?" I asked. "Paperwork," he said. "You're organizing it." Something like that. I helped him sort the files into piles. While we worked, he started talking about the family in a way he never had before. "You ever notice," he said, "how some people rewrite history when it suits them?" I shrugged. "People do that all the time." He nodded. "Yes, but it's worse when families do it." He didn't explain what he meant, not then, but over the next year I began noticing small things, things that didn't quite add up. For example, my parents had always told everyone that Jason helped Grandpa constantly. They loved repeating that story. "Jason is the only one who really looks out for Arthur," my mother would say at family gatherings. But the truth was, Jason almost never visited. I knew because I was the one who was actually there, fixing Grandpa's internet, helping him organize documents, setting up security cameras after someone broke into a neighbor's garage. Jason, meanwhile, was usually busy, or tired, or simply uninterested. But when relatives came around, the story changed. Suddenly, Jason was the devoted grandson, and I was just Sophie, the one who exaggerated things, the one who sometimes misremembered events. One afternoon, about 6 months before Grandpa died, he asked me to come by earlier than usual. When I arrived, he was standing in his study in front of the wall safe. "You ever wonder what's in here?" he asked. "Not really," I said. He smiled. "You should." He moved the painting aside and entered a combination. The safe clicked open. Inside were several folders, a small locked box, and something that looked like a portable hard drive. I didn't look too closely. It felt private, but Grandpa seemed strangely calm about showing it to me. "You're good with computers," he said. "Yeah, and you understand how digital records work, I guess." He closed the safe again and turned back to me. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the truth needs to be preserved somewhere people can't change it." I frowned. "What do you mean?" But he waved the question away. "Never mind. Old man thoughts." Then he smiled and asked if I wanted coffee. At the time, I assumed he was just being philosophical, but now I realized that moment meant much more than I understood. Because about 3 months later, Grandpa's health started to decline. It happened quickly. At first, it was small things: fatigue, shortness of breath. Then came the hospital visits, the tests, the quiet conversations between doctors and my parents in the hallway. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, everyone knew the truth. Grandpa didn't have much time left. The family gathered at his house that year instead of our usual holiday dinner at my parents' place. It was the first time Jason had visited in months. He spent most of the evening talking loudly about his future plans, even though his football career was clearly over. My parents nodded along, pretending everything was still on track. Meanwhile, Grandpa mostly sat quietly in his chair. At one point, he motioned for me to come over. "Sophie," he said softly, "can you help me with something in the study later?" Of course, but we never got the chance, because later that night, my father announced something that would start the biggest argument our family had ever had. An argument about money, about the house, about what would happen after Grandpa was gone, and that argument would eventually lead to the moment where my father stood in front of everyone at the funeral, looked directly at me, and called me a liar. That too much food, too many forced smiles, and attention. No, Grandpa sat at the head of the table like he always had, though he looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted his glass. My mother kept insisting Jason talked loudly about transferring to a different school. Dad mostly listened occasionally. For a while the conversation stayed harmless. Football, weather, politics. Then somewhere between dessert and coffee, my father cleared his throat. It was the same sound he used when he was about to say something important. "You know," he began, leaning back in his chair, "we should probably talk about the house." The room went quiet. Grandpa looked up slowly. "The house?" he asked. Dad nodded. "Well, you know, the future." My Aunt Susan shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Daniel," she said carefully, "maybe this isn't the right time." But Dad waved her off. "It's practical," he said. "We need to think ahead." Jason leaned forward, suddenly interested. "What about the house?" he asked. Dad gestured around the room. "This place is valuable. Property values in this area have gone way up." Grandpa didn't say anything. He just watched my father. Dad continued. "Maintaining a house like this isn't easy, especially once." He hesitated briefly before finishing the sentence. "Once things change." My stomach tightened. Everyone understood what he meant. Once Grandpa was gone. Mom nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe it would make sense to sell it," she said. Jason shrugged. "Yeah. Split the money." Grandpa's expression didn't change, but I noticed his fingers tighten slightly around his fork. My Aunt Susan spoke again. "Arthur hasn't even said what he wants to do yet." Dad smiled in a way that wasn't really a smile. "Well, I'm just saying, we should have a plan." Jason glanced toward me. "What do you think, Sophie?" he asked casually. The way he said my name made it sound like a joke. I hadn't planned to speak, but something about the conversation felt wrong. "This is Grandpa's house," I said. "Shouldn't he decide what happens to it?" Jason smirked. "Well, obviously. But we're family," Dad added quickly. "These things affect all of us." Grandpa finally set his fork down. "You all seem very interested in my house," he said quietly. No one answered. He looked at each of us in turn. Jason, my parents, then me. "I'm not dead yet," he said. The words landed in the room like a stone. My father cleared his throat again. Of course not, Dad. That's not what we meant. Grandpa pushed his chair back slightly. I think dinner is over. No one argued. People stood up slowly, carrying dishes to the kitchen. The conversation never resumed. Later that evening, as guests began leaving, Grandpa motioned for me to come into the study. The door closed behind us. For a moment, he just stood there looking tired. I shouldn't have to listen to people dividing up my life before I'm gone, he said. I'm sorry, I replied quietly. He waved the apology away. It's not your fault. Then he walked over to the wall safe again. The painting slid aside. He opened the safe and removed a small device. A USB drive. This, he said, holding it carefully, is a backup. Backup of what? Something important. He placed the drive on the desk between us. If anything ever happens to me before I finish organizing things, I want you to remember where the safe is. I stared at him. Grandpa? What are you talking about? He smiled faintly. Just an old man preparing for stubborn relatives. I didn't laugh. Because suddenly I had the strange feeling he wasn't joking at all. He put the USB drive back inside the safe and locked it. Then he turned to me. Sophie, he said gently, if the time ever comes when people start arguing about what's true, don't let them talk you out of what you know. I nodded slowly, but I still didn't understand what he meant. Not fully. A few months later, his condition worsened. Hospital visits turned into overnight stays. Overnight stays turned into long stretches where he barely left the house. I visited whenever I could between classes and work. Jason rarely came. My parents visited occasionally, but their conversations with him were often short, mostly about practical things. Doctors, medication, insurance. Then one morning during my final semester of college, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded strange. Sophie, she said quietly, your grandfather passed away this morning. Everything after that felt like a blur. The funeral arrangements, the phone calls, the drive back home. By the time the funeral ended 2 days later, the entire Bennett family had gathered at Grandpa's house. Relatives filled the living room. Neighbors brought food. People shared stories about the man who had lived there for 4 decades. And standing in that same room, looking at the study door just down the hallway, I suddenly remembered what Grandpa had told me. The safe, the USB drive, the backup. So I did the one thing no one in my family expected. I spoke up. I told them Grandpa had left something important in the safe. And that was the moment my father laughed. The moment my brother smirked. The moment my mother rubbed her temples like she'd heard this kind of story from me 100 times before. And the moment my father looked straight at me in front of the entire room and said the words he had been saying my whole life. Stop lying about your grandfather, Sophie. But what none of them knew yet was that someone else had just arrived at the front door. Someone holding a briefcase. Someone who had been my grandfather's lawyer for 30 years. And inside the study, a safe was about to be opened. The knock on the front door cut straight through the tension in the room. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. For a moment, no one moved. My father was still standing in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, clearly expecting me to back down and apologize for making things up again. Instead, my Aunt Susan walked toward the door. When she opened it, a tall man in a dark coat stepped inside, shaking a bit of rain from his shoulders. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Callahan, I said quietly. My grandfather's lawyer. He had handled Arthur Bennett's legal affairs for more than 30 years. The room went silent again as he stepped further inside, holding a leather briefcase. Good afternoon, he said politely. My father looked confused. Can we help you? The lawyer offered a small nod. Daniel Bennett, I presume. Yes, I'm Robert Callahan. I worked with your father for many years. Dad relaxed slightly. Oh, right. Of course. Callahan glanced around the room, noticing the relatives, the half-empty coffee cups, the funeral flowers still sitting on the table. My condolences to all of you, he said. Then he turned his attention toward the hallway. There's something your father asked me to take care of today. Dad frowned. What kind of thing? The lawyer adjusted his glasses. He asked that I come here after the funeral to open the safe in his study. The entire room froze. My father slowly turned his head toward me. Jason's smirk disappeared. My mother's eyes widened slightly. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Jason let out a short laugh. Wait, you mean the safe Sophie was just talking about? Callahan nodded. Yes. Jason looked from the lawyer to me, then back again. You're serious? I'm afraid so. My father's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. Why would my father want a lawyer here to open a safe? Callahan opened his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope, because he instructed me to do exactly that. He held the envelope up slightly. Written instructions. Dad took a step closer. What instructions? Callahan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room again. Arthur specified that all immediate family members should be present when the safe is opened. Well, Dad said stiffly, gesturing toward the room we're all here. Jason folded his arms. This should be interesting. My heart was beating faster now. Not because I was nervous about being wrong, but because I suddenly realized Grandpa had planned this moment very carefully. Callahan closed his briefcase. Then perhaps we should proceed. No one objected. A small crowd formed as we walked down the hallway toward the study. The room looked exactly as it always had. Bookshelves, stacks of papers, the old wooden desk where Grandpa used to drink his morning coffee. Callahan stopped in front of the painting on the wall, the one that hid the safe. My father watched closely. I didn't even know that was there, he muttered. Callahan moved the painting aside. The metal door appeared behind it, a heavy safe built directly into the wall. Jason whistled softly. Well, I'll be damned. Callahan turned the dial slowly. The quiet clicks echoed in the small room. Behind me, I could hear relatives whispering. My father stood with his arms crossed, clearly irritated, but now unable to deny what was happening. Then the final click sounded. The safe door opened. Inside were several neatly arranged items, folders, a small locked box, and a black USB drive. Callahan reached inside and removed a thick envelope. On the front, written in my grandfather's handwriting, were 4 words. For the family meeting. Callahan turned back toward the room. Arthur asked that this letter be read aloud before anything else. Jason leaned against the desk. All right, he said. Let's hear it. Callahan opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. The room grew completely silent. He began to read. If you are hearing this, it means I'm no longer around to settle certain disagreements in person. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Callahan continued. For years, I have watched my family argue about what is true and what is not. My father's jaw tightened slightly. So I decided to do something about it. Callahan paused briefly. In the safe behind me are records, documents, and digital files that explain several things I believe this family has misunderstood for a very long time. Jason raised an eyebrow. What kind of things? Callahan kept reading. Most importantly, these files explain why Sophie Bennett is the only member of this family I trusted to help me prepare them. Every head in the room turned toward me. Jason's expression changed first, then my father's, then my mother's. Callahan read the next line slowly. For years, Sophie has been the one helping me maintain records, secure my documents, and preserve information I believed might one day be questioned. My father shook his head slightly. This doesn't make any sense. Callahan lowered the paper, just long enough to say something else. There's more. He looked back at the letter. And if anyone in the room still believes Sophie has been exaggerating the truth, the USB drive in this safe contains video recordings explaining everything in my own words. Jason straightened up. Video recordings. Callahan nodded. Yes. My father's face had gone pale, because suddenly the story everyone in the family had repeated for years The story about Sophie Bennett being unreliable was about to collide with something much harder to ignore. Evidence, recorded by the one person none of them had ever doubted. Arthur Bennett. For a moment after the letter was read, no one spoke. The study suddenly felt smaller, like the air had been pulled out of the room. My father cleared his throat. "This is ridiculous," he said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as it usually did. Dad must have misunderstood something. Jason crossed his arms, but his earlier smirk was gone. Misunderstood what he asked. Callahan calmly placed the letter on the desk. Arthur left very clear instructions, he said. Then he reached back into the safe and picked up the black USB drive. This contains several video files. My mother frowned. Video files? Yes. Callahan looked directly at me. Sophie, I assume you know how to play these. Every eye in the room shifted toward me again. For a second, the old instinct kicked in. The familiar feeling of being the kid everyone expected to mess something up. But then I remembered Grandpa sitting at his kitchen table. "Don't let them talk you out of the truth." "I can do it," I said. Callahan nodded and handed me the drive. My hands were steady as I walked to Grandpa's computer. It was the same old desktop I had fixed a dozen times. The same one my parents used to joke about. The screen flickered on. I inserted the USB drive. A folder appeared. Inside were several files labeled by date. The earliest one was nearly 3 years old. Jason leaned forward slightly. "Are we really doing this?" "Yes," Callahan said. I double-clicked the first video. The screen went black for a second. Then my grandfather appeared. He was sitting in the exact same chair that was now empty across the room. The lighting was soft coming from the window beside him. He looked older than I remembered, but his voice was steady. "If you're watching this," he said, "it means the safe has been opened." No one moved. Even Jason stopped shifting his weight. Grandpa looked directly into the camera. "I imagine there's probably some confusion in the room right now." My father stared at the screen. Grandpa continued. "So let's start with something simple." He paused. "Sophie Bennett has been helping me manage my records for several years." My father shook his head immediately. "That's not." Callahan raised a hand. "Please." On the screen, Grandpa continued. "She set up the digital storage system you're about to see. She helped me scan documents, back up files, and secure information that I believed might be important one day." Jason glanced at me. For the first time in his life, he looked uncertain. Grandpa leaned slightly closer to the camera. "And before anyone in the room decides to dismiss this as another one of Sophie's so-called stories, let me explain something." The room was completely silent. "Everything stored on this drive has been time-stamped, verified, and duplicated." He gestured slightly off-screen. "My lawyer has copies." Callahan nodded quietly. Grandpa's voice grew firmer. "For years I have watched my family treat Sophie as though her word meant less than everyone else's." My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father didn't look away from the screen. "And I've watched certain people in this family take advantage of that." Jason frowned. "What does that mean?" The video continued. "You see," Grandpa said calmly, "when people believe one person in the room is always wrong, they stop checking the facts." The next part of the video made my father's face turn red, so I started documenting things. Grandpa reached toward the desk in front of him, and what I discovered was interesting. Callahan spoke quietly. "There are additional files." I opened another folder. Inside were dozens of scanned documents, bank transfers, email printouts, maintenance invoices. Jason leaned closer to the screen. "What is all this?" Grandpa's voice answered from the video. "For example, the story about Jason being the one who regularly helped me maintain the house." Jason straightened. "That's true." Grandpa shook his head slowly on the screen. "No, it isn't." The room froze again. "Over the past 4 years," Grandpa continued, "Jason has visited this house exactly 6 times." Jason's mouth opened slightly. "What?" Grandpa continued calmly. Sophie has visited 72 times. My father looked stunned. That can't be right. Callahan spoke again. The security system logs are included in the records. My mother's face went pale. Jason looked at me, then back at the screen. Grandpa kept speaking. Now that might seem like a small thing. He folded his hands. But it's not the only example. Another folder opened automatically. Emails appeared on the screen. My father leaned closer. What are those? Grandpa answered. Correspondence regarding several financial matters. Callahan flipped through the printed copies he had taken from the safe. Arthur documented multiple instances where family members misrepresented financial assistance they claimed to provide. Jason stepped back slightly. My father's voice rose. This is absurd. But Grandpa's voice cut through the room again. And finally, there is the matter of the house. The study went completely silent. Because everyone knew that was the conversation that had started the Thanksgiving argument months earlier. Grandpa looked straight into the camera. I believe my son Daniel was planning to convince the family that selling the house quickly was the best option. My father's jaw tightened. That was a suggestion. Grandpa shook his head. What Daniel didn't realize was that I had already made arrangements. Callahan slowly reached into the safe again and pulled out a second envelope. On the front were 2 words written in thick black ink. Property transfer. Jason looked confused. What does that mean? Callahan opened the envelope. Inside was a single legal document. He read the first line quietly, then he looked up, and for the first time since arriving, even he looked slightly surprised. Arthur Bennett transferred ownership of this house 6 months ago. My father frowned. To who? Callahan turned the document so everyone could see the name printed clearly at the top, and the room went completely silent. Because the name written there was Sophie Bennett. For a few seconds after Callahan read the name, the room didn't react at all. It was like everyone had stopped processing words. Then Jason laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound. Okay, he said. That's funny. No one else laughed. My father stepped forward and grabbed the document from Callahan's hands. His eyes scanned the page quickly, then again, and again. That's not possible, he said. Callahan spoke calmly. It is. The property transfer was completed 6 months ago. My mother's voice came out almost as a whisper. Sophie owns the house. Yes, Callahan replied. Jason turned toward me slowly. You knew about this? I shook my head. No, and that part was the truth. Grandpa had shown me the safe. He had talked about preserving records. But he had never once told me the house was being transferred to my name. My father looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly made no sense. This has to be some kind of mistake, he said. Callahan shook his head. It isn't. He tapped the document. Arthur signed the transfer in my office. All paperwork was filed with the county. Jason's voice grew louder. Why would he give the house to Sophie? No one answered, but the computer screen still showed my grandfather sitting in that chair. And suddenly, I realized something. There's another video, I said quietly. Everyone turned toward the monitor again. My hands moved across the keyboard. I opened the final file. The video started. Grandpa looked a little older in this one, a little more tired, but his voice was still steady. If you've reached this recording, he said, then Robert has probably just read the property transfer. Jason muttered under his breath. You've got to be kidding me, Grandpa continued. I imagine some people in that room are surprised. My father stared at the screen. Grandpa leaned forward slightly. I didn't make this decision lightly. He paused. This house has been part of my life for more than 40 years. The camera angle shifted slightly as if he had adjusted it himself. And for most of those years, I assumed it would eventually stay in the family. Jason nodded slightly. Exactly, he said quietly. Grandpa's next sentence cut straight through that assumption. But a house should go to someone who actually cares about it. Silence. You see, Grandpa said Sophie is the one who has been here. He began counting softly on his fingers. When the roof needed inspection, when the security cameras stopped working, when I needed help scanning paperwork, when I couldn't figure out how to use that ridiculous phone your generation insists on. A few relatives shifted awkwardly. Grandpa smiled faintly. She showed up. His expression became more serious, and she never once asked for anything in return. Jason's jaw tightened. Grandpa looked directly into the camera again. I've watched how this family treats her. No one in the study moved. I've watched people dismiss her, talk over her, assume she must be wrong simply because she's Sophie. My mother looked down at the floor. My father's face had gone completely still. Grandpa continued. But here's the truth. He pointed toward the camera. She's the most capable person in this family. Jason scoffed quietly. But he didn't interrupt. Grandpa leaned back slightly in his chair. So yes, I transferred the house to Sophie Bennett. He paused. And I did it for a very simple reason. His voice softened. Because she's the only one I trust not to turn it into a fight. The video ended. The room stayed silent for a long time. No one rushed to argue. No one laughed. For the first time in my life, my family looked at me without the usual assumptions already written on their faces. Jason was the first to speak. So what now? He asked. My father finally looked away from the screen. His voice sounded strange. Sophie. It was the first time all afternoon he had said my name without irritation. I didn't know. I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, it didn't really matter whether he knew or not. What mattered was that my grandfather had known. Known what was happening. Known how the family worked. And decided to leave behind proof. Callahan closed his briefcase quietly. Well, he said my job here is finished. My father still looked stunned. Jason ran a hand through his hair. So the house just belongs to Sophie now. Yes, Callahan said. Another long silence filled the room. Finally, my mother spoke softly. You're really going to keep it? Everyone looked at me. The question hung in the air. For a moment, I looked around the study. The shelves, the desk, the safe built into the wall. This house was full of memories. Some good, some complicated. Then I remembered the last thing my grandfather had told me at the kitchen table. Don't let them talk you out of the truth. I took a slow breath. I haven't decided what I'll do with the house yet, I said. Jason frowned. What does that mean? It means, I replied calmly, that I get to decide. No one argued. For once, there wasn't anything they could say. I walked past them toward the door of the study. Halfway down the hallway, I heard my father call my name again. Sophie. I stopped, but didn't turn around. I'm sorry, he said. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. I thought about responding. Thought about all the years of being ignored, doubted, or dismissed. But in the end, I simply nodded once and continued walking. Because the truth had already spoken for itself. And for the first time in my life, no one in the Bennett family was calling Sophie Bennett a liar anymore.